You can get another cookie or drink or coffee or something right now. Be very silent and quiet. Don't come up the middle. You're walking across live TV again. Okay, don't worry about it. We'll survive. Anyway, sacred cookies off the side. Book group, which is coordinated by George Sroka, is taking a break for the summer, but they are having a little social. If you're in the group, you know about it. If you're not in the group and you'd like to join, they usually pick a book that's recommended by Bill and Holly, or or something that's triggered by ordinary life. And just let me know after class, and I'll be happy to give you George's contact information. Since George is not here. Where are you, George? Anyway. Also, Ordinary Women of the Day are taking a break from our regular meetings, but we are doing food pantry distribution on the second Saturday of the month for Boynton. Contact me after class if you want to join in. Frida is actually the one who coordinates, but I'll be happy to pass it on to her. Financial donations, our sacred financial donations, are still, we have the plates in the back for you to put money in. Wayne Herbert, did you put the plates out there?
He did.
He did. All right, he did. So you can do it now or later and afterwards. Don't get up in the middle of Bill and Holly's fun talk. But anyway, at some point, your generosity is very, very much appreciated, and all the money goes to a good cause. I'd like to remind everybody, or if you don't know, that there's a Pride picnic after the 11 o'clock service. Should start about noon. Lunch is provided, but a $10 donation is appreciated. So please join in. You're welcome to attend. Please join in and celebrate. And we will be meeting next Sunday, July 4th. We will be meeting. Now, did I leave anything off that y'all told me in the last 30 seconds when I was standing up here?
Well, John and Watson is not here today, our floor manager, because he has taken Olivia to New York for college checkouts.
Well, and she's in a film program.
And a 3-week film program. Yeah. I cannot believe that she's going off to college. What else? Stay for the picnic today. Even if you didn't register, you can stay or come back if you want to leave here. Anything else?
No. Announcements? No, I don't think so.
So, no matter who you are, no matter where you are in your spiritual journey, you are welcome here. So, the way of paradox and contradiction, wisdom teachings for the living of ordinary life. This theme suggested itself to me and then to us out of the reading that Holly and I did during the shutdown. And so I want to give credit to several sources, many of whom you've heard me talk about before: Daramuda Muraku, Jim Finley, Alan Watts, writings by and about Meister Eckhart, a host of other people. Jim Finley is an authority on the mystics, especially Teresa of Avila, Meister Eckhart, and John of the Cross. And I have attended conferences with Finley over the years and gotten to know him. I tried to get him to come here, but he was dealing with his wife, who was at the time very sick. She's since passed away. And he had asked us to read Dark Night of the Soul, Meister Eckhart, sermons by Meister Eckhart, and Teresa of Avila. And I found it tough navigating those waters. And so I asked Jim Finley what he would recommend to me as a book that would help me understand Meister Eckhart better. And the book that he recommended was this one, The Way of Paradox, by Cyprian Smith. And I got to tell you, it's tough slogging too. But somewhere during the time of the shutdown, as Holly and I continued to collaborate, we discovered more and more moments of entanglement. And one of them was when each of us bought the same book at the same time without telling each other about it. And this is the book, and please don't buy it.
Why? It's great.
Oh,
I think he just wants to tell you about
don't
it
throw me in
before
the
you.
briar patch kind of thing.
Oh, I see. Well, Amazon told each of us to buy it. I think that was really what happened. Yeah.
This is really a delightful book. And it's where we found the inspiration for today's time, which we're calling Pay Attention to the Nothing. And here's the passage that we read. Both of us quoted it to each other like that the day after we found it. The text that this passage from Eckhart is based on is Paul's conversion experience. Paul rose from the ground and with eyes open saw nothing. So this is what Eckhart says. Pay attention to the nothing the apostle saw with open eyes, and consider what a wonderful word this nothing is. What does this mean? I say that it could mean 4 things. First, he saw the nothing that was God. Second, when he got up, he saw nothing but God. Third, in all things he saw nothing but God. And fourth, when he saw God, he saw all things as nothing. He goes on. Which one of these is true for you depends on how you look, not what you see. So pay attention to this nothing in the way you look, and in everything find God with open eyes. Pay attention to the nothing. And you also, those of you who are here, I know you well enough to know that the most useful, wisest spiritual teachings cannot really be put into words. But we continue to try. Yeah. Non-duality, as Finley said, communicates itself, and he discovered this when he was trying to write Thomas Merton's biography, which he titled Merton's Palace of Nowhere. You know that Jim Finley ran away from home when he was 17. He was raised in an abusive, alcoholic family. His mother was a devout Roman Catholic. His father was a raging, abusive alcoholic. He ran away from home because in high school he had read something that had by Thomas Merton, and he decided that he wanted to go to the Gethsemane Monastery where Merton was, and Merton became his spiritual teacher. And after a number of years there, then he Finley left. He became a Buddhist, and he became a clinical psychologist, and now he's a spiritual director par excellence. He's an authority on the mystics and really great things. Another non-dual book that's good to know is Being Nobody Going Nowhere. So spiritual writings are full of contradiction and paradox. I thought of many of the titles of Richard Rohr's book, Breathing Underwater. That's kind of hard to do. Falling Upward. Dancing While Sitting Down. So you know the teachings of Jesus are full of paradox and contradiction, the biggest of which, and he said this over and over, if you want to have life, you must be willing to give it up. So here's Meister Eckhart introducing into the mix the story of Saul, who became Paul. It's a story of paradox and contradiction, and it's a story of great transformation, which we all say we desperately want, but at the same time are really wary of. So we ourselves are paradox and contradiction.
Yeah. I'm generally one of those people who's wary of instant conversion moments. I think kind of in the same way I'm wary of instant coffee that just sort of dissolves in hot water. But if we interpret Scripture mystically, we might see that the nothing was actually the creative, fecund ground from which everything came. I've talked a little bit about Catherine Keller in here, who writes about the tehomic theology, meaning the theology that comes from nothing. So nothingness is actually everything. So we might also see that if we're present to that nothing, to the presence of possibility, that these conversion moments are always available. The deeper we go into that tehomic theology, the more we learn how to see. That's what the poem says. It's how you see, not what you see. The simplest meaning of conversion is to change. And we are changing all the time. By the time you leave this class, something in your body will have changed. You're constantly cycling new air through your body and breathing old air out. So we are kind of like the universe, a professor of mine once said, a chaotic force, one that blends chaos and order. That's happening all the time in our bodies. So Descartes, famous philosopher, introduced dualism, he kept dualism going maybe for longer than it needed to. But philosophers used to imagine that the soul, he in fact introduced this idea, the aspect of God that is within us was contained in this tiny little walnut-shaped thing in the center of our brains called the pineal gland. He imagined that light transmitted images to the brain, which then activated these animal spirits to carry information to the rest of the body. Perhaps this pineal gland, which we still don't know a whole lot about, but have proven some things about it, was just mysterious enough to be able to contain the great mystery that is God. Incidentally, the primary function of the pineal gland is to receive information about the state of light and dark that gets transmitted through the eyeball. I love that metaphor for today, the state of light and dark from the environment. Jesus knew, and he taught, that the human soul was both light and dark, blind and seeing. He knew that our growth depended on integrating these aspects of ourselves, our dark and our light, of being constantly humbled by our incredible capacity for both harm and healing. This is not in my notes, but this past week, my husband and my children and I were on kind of a civil rights tour, really more like a pilgrimage through Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, and then through New Orleans, which is more of a celebratory place. But it just, you become so aware that the human capacity for harm and hurt is so large, and we were faced with that time and time and time again. I've often wished that I could speak in pictures, like as I talked that there weren't words coming out, but just open my mouth and be able to give you the picture that I'm trying to paint. That's probably why I'm an artist, Terry. But instead of images flowing forth, I also wish that I could pepper these images with the layers of sounds and textures in the moment I'm trying to paint. So as I'm sitting here, I'm wondering, how can I help you hear this kind of, I was writing this early in the morning in a hotel room while my kids were still sleeping and my husband was snoring. The children are breathing, the birds are chirping, the traffic's going by, all these layered sounds. I can't speak that, but it was all happening. But when we engage our kind of active imagination, we can be transported to another time and another place. The words and the stories we tell help us relate to the environment we're in. They help us learn about history and help us share our personal experience. And stories can also help us heal. Here's a true story. I was in Montgomery, Alabama last week. It's a small town, just under 200,000 people, with many shops and storefronts now closed. I don't know if that's entirely a result of COVID. It was a bit of a sleepy town before. We had been to the Equal Justice Initiative a couple years ago and went back with the kids. But it's the place where the domestic slave trade thrived. It's also the place where the civil rights movement was birthed.
Here's my shirt.
Yeah, it's an EJI, blue, extra large, favorite color, just in case you ever want to get Bill a shirt. But there are signs scattered throughout the city that tell the story of how this city came to be. And one, I was telling Bill before we started that, in one exit you'll see like the first White House of the Confederacy. The next exit you see Peace and Justice Memorial. It's this place of contradictions. So in fits and starts, these other signs have started to kind of crop up that include the not so pretty past, thanks to the work of people like Brian Stevenson and his colleagues at the Equal Justice Initiative. I learned, for example, that Montgomery's primary commerce dealt in human beings between 1820 and 1860, and that the first aggressive act of the Civil War was issued with a decree from this very building to fire upon Fort Sumter. I also learned that this building was a common site for lynchings. During the founding years of Montgomery, the number of enslaved in Alabama grew from 41,000 to 450,000. And they proceeded to build the roads, buildings, and railroads that allowed that city to thrive at the time. It was a major commerce site. And for a relatively small city, Montgomery had the second largest population of enslaved people. This city was founded on agony, so the agony of some and the prosperity of others. The older buildings that still line Commerce Street, down which enslaved people were shackled and paraded for auction, these are the buildings that once warehoused them. So one such building is the Equal Justice Initiative. And right when you walk inside, this is on the wall. Not only did the enslaved people make the bricks that created the buildings, they were also warehoused in them. So they essentially were forced to construct their own captivity. To be led out of our past, to kind of bring forth the stories that are within us, not just inside of us, but in our society, the past that binds us to an unhealed present, it helps to engage with the stories, and especially those that have been left out and denied, so that we as a society might begin to tell new stories that heal and expose us to multiple perspectives. Eddie Glaude wrote, and I love him, he's a Princeton professor, commentator. He wrote recently a fantastic book on James Baldwin. He said, "Who and what we choose to exclude exposes the limits of our ideas about justice." So there's another kind of story, as Bill said earlier, that is truer than true. This is the type of story that we're going to lead you through today. It has all the elements of a good tale, I think. A villain and a hero, drama, climax, and resolution. In this story, and I refer to him throughout as Saul because he's not yet taken on the name Paul. Saul is led out from his life of injustice. As we tell it, and we'll get there, we're not there yet, we want you to kind of drop in and engage your active imaginations. Allow yourself to kind of descend into the scene. Imagine those layered sounds that I tried to paint in here, which is in the hotel room that I told you about. Take root in one or all of the characters. Imagine who you are, where you might stand, what you might see and hear. In Dream Life, it's said, and you can say far more about this than I can, it's said that an aspect of self is represented in each of the characters in the dream. And each one of those characters reveals something to us. So perhaps this story can do the same. Notice for you what aspects you reject, embrace, question, or long for more of. Notice who you most relate to and who you feel most different from in the story.
So, depending on your church background, you grew up being exposed to different kinds of emphases. If you were Presbyterian, you know a lot about the Reformation and about Calvin. If you're Roman Catholic, you know why there are 7 sacraments instead of 2. If you're Lutheran, you can quote all the commandments. If you're an Episcopalian, you know which salad fork to use.
If you're good, waspy
And
lineage.
if you're Baptist, you know the Bible. You grew up being taught the Bible. So before telling the story of Saul, his conversion experience on the road to Damascus is something I bet everybody knows something about, whether they've got church background or not. And it is a story that has contributed to a lot of phrases in our language. He had a Damascus Road experience, or I've seen the light, that sort of thing. So Paul himself has had as much influence on the shape that the early church took as almost anybody. and he's also been incredibly misunderstood. Most of the New Testament writings are by Paul or one of his imitators. Before he became famous, Paul was known as a tent maker. He was a good rabbinic student. He's also famous for founding churches and writing letters, and he's also famous for being very difficult to understand. Now, in the process of talking about Paul and his writings, I may say some things that are new to some of you, especially about the content and structure of the Bible, especially those parts that have been attributed to Paul. In my experience over the entirety of my ministry, one of the things I've discovered is that more often than not, it has been people who have claimed the most loyalty to the Bible who have known the least about it. So I want to begin kind of basic and then go deep. How many books are there in the Bible? Now, this is a trick question. None. Almost. They're documents, they're letters, they're writings. Much of the Bible's writings, like those attributed to Paul, are letters that were written not to us, but to specific congregations to deal with specific problems. Mm-hmm. So there's 66 books in the Bible that most Protestants are familiar with. Easy to remember. Roman Catholics are familiar with 73 documents in their collection. And we divide them into what we call the Old Testament and the New Testament. Both of those are misnomers. We should call them the Hebrew Scriptures and the Christian collection. Something old and new is a distinctly, quote, Christian thing to do. Easy to remember. There are 39 books in the Old Testament and 27 books in the New Testament. Easy to remember. Old has 3 letters. Testament has 9. 3 and 9, 39. New Testament, New has 3. Testament has 9. 3 times 9 is 27. Easy to remember. You'll never forget that again.
Test next week.
There will be a test, I think. So, as I said, it's really more appropriate to refer to the writings we have as documents and not books, and this is especially true when it comes to the writings of Paul. Though 13 letters, this is the kind of thing that I saw in the Baptist church where I grew up. The Bible is a library divided into law, history, poetry, et cetera, et cetera. And notice at the bottom, all of those are Paul's letters. 13 letters in the Christian collection are attributed to Paul. Actually, he only wrote 7 of them. 6 are attributed to people who were Paul's disciples, Paul's imitators. And it was a common thing in that time to use somebody else's name to gain authority for what you were putting out. The books in the Christian collection were not written in the order that they appear in the Christian collection. It was not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that were written first. The first composed document that we have is 1 Thessalonians, and then Galatians, and then Romans. And it is in Galatians that we find the first creed of the Christian church. Know what it was? Anybody?
I think you're going to tell us.
Well, you're cheating.
I get to read ahead.
No, it's not. I didn't put it in my notes. But we are going to deal with it. The first affirmation of faith in the Christian faith was Jesus is Lord, right? That's the first. The first creed is in Galatians. Paul didn't write it. He was quoting from an earlier part of the Christian movement, and that creedal statement was a baptismal formula that was used when people were baptized into the church. In Christ, there is neither Jew, Greek, slave or free, male or female. That's the first creed in the Christian church. So they dealt very early on with class, with race, with gender. And we lost that. I mean, you did think what happened to the Christian church. But we're going to get to that creed. So what I am sharing with you has been known since the early 19th century. And one of the ways the church has failed you is that it did not include this information in the Christian education curriculum of the churches where we grew up. We didn't learn this stuff in church. That's my rant for today. Okay, so let's talk about Paul. We don't know when Paul was born, but it was probably sometime in the first decade of the first century. He was probably 10 years younger than Jesus. He lived a very vigorous, hard life. He was plagued by a physical malady, which we don't know what was. He was executed in Rome sometime in the mid-60s. Now, that's not in the Christian writings, but it's such a strong tradition that scholars think that it's true. He was a Jew, born not in Jewish territory, but outside of Jewish territory. Scholars say that at the time of Paul, the number of Jews in that century in Rome, or in that area of the world, numbered around 6 million. That's about 1/10 of the population of Rome at the time. Now, here's something that may come as a surprise to some of you. It did to students of mine when I was teaching in the seminary. Paul never knew Jesus. Paul never met Jesus. But nonetheless, almost immediately after Jesus' execution, he became a persecutor of Jesus' followers. And that he did this is an indication not only of his religious passion, but also that he knew enough about Jesus to think that he was dangerous and that the movement should be stopped. That's why you persecute people. So Paul is introduced to us in the book that we refer to as the Acts of the Apostles, the writing called Acts. And he is a bystander at the first martyrdom that we have written about in Christian scripture, and that's the martyrdom of Stephen, St. Stephen's Day. And then in Acts 9, we learn that Paul was given authority by the high priest in Jerusalem to arrest followers of Jesus in Damascus. I'm going to show you a map later. Huge territory that he traveled. And he was supposed to bring these Jesus followers in Damascus to Jerusalem for persecution.
I can't do this biblical history and literacy stuff, so I'm
I
grateful.
love doing it, and I think it's important to do. I think that it's important.
Well,
to
it
do.
helps us be there where this was happening. So here we are in what, 60 AD?
60. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So my wariness of spontaneous conversion moments notwithstanding, something incredible happened to Saul on the road. He had what William James, who's credited with being one of the first psychologists, and he was also a philosopher and theologian, called a spiritual experience that leaves one changed. James is widely considered the founder of psychology, in fact, and also of pragmatic philosophy. In his seminal work, I don't know who has read this, but The Varieties of Religious Experience, you probably had to read it.
Yes,
in school. But anyhow, he explicates these experiences that reveal one's inner nature to oneself. He says they contain 4 essential qualities. So here's William James. The first quality is that they are ineffable, which means they're hard to talk about. A mystical experience defies expression, and words often do not do it justice. The experience is the understanding of it. So the second we try to put words to it, we're putting it in kind of dual mind. We're putting it inside of dual language. Remember that Saul was rendered silent for days. Here we reach the limitations of language again. So there's no way to really know what went on in Saul's soul. All we can do is try to talk about it to help us experience what he might have gone through. And we're going to tell you the story so that you can try to feel it in your own body. The second quality is that it contains a noetic quality. So even though mystical states are similar to states of feeling, more like a body sensation and a kind of overwhelm, they also seem to those who experience them to be states of deep knowing too. The kind of deep knowing that, again, we can't put words to. They're experienced as states that allow direct insight into the depths of ourselves that are truly unplumbed. Our intellect doesn't have words for them yet. And maybe wisdom, growing in wisdom, is the ability to start to put words to them, to try and teach. So they are illuminations, revelations, full of significance and importance, and they carry with them what James describes as a curious sense of authority. There are two additional characteristics, and he says they feature sometimes less prominently in these spiritual experience, but they're transient. In other words, we can't stay in the spiritual experience